The Empire of Hollow Promises, how Carillion built its own grave. Picture this. It's January 15th, 2018, and across Britain, construction sites fall silent. Hospital projects worth billions grind to a halt. School constructions are abandoned mid-build. Cleaning services at government buildings simply stop. The cause? Carillion, Britain's second-largest construction company, had just collapsed overnight, taking with it 43,000 jobs worldwide and leaving the British government scrambling to pick up the pieces of critical infrastructure projects. This wasn't just a company failure. This was a catastrophic implosion that exposed the dark underbelly of corporate Britain and left taxpayers holding a bill that would eventually reach into the billions. But how does a company that built some of Britain's most iconic structures, employed nearly 50,000 people, and held government contracts worth over £7 billion simply vanish into thin air? The answer lies in a toxic cocktail of aggressive accounting, reckless expansion, and a corporate culture so focused on short-term profits that it literally built its own grave. The story begins in 1999 when Tarmac, a well-established British construction and building materials company, spun off its construction division to create Carillion. The name itself was meant to evoke the sound of church bells, a symbol of celebration and reliability. The newly formed company inherited Tarmac's construction expertise and immediately positioned itself as a major player in the British infrastructure game. From day one, Carillion's strategy was built around public-private partnerships, those controversial deals where private companies finance, build, and operate public infrastructure projects like hospitals, schools, and roads, then lease them back to the government for decades. It was a model that promised steady, long-term revenue streams, but it would prove to be Carillion's poison chalice. The company's first major coup came with the $400 million contract to build the new Royal Liverpool University Hospital, a project that should have been a showcase of British construction excellence, but instead became a symbol of everything wrong with the industry. Under CEO John McDonough's leadership from 2001 to 2011, Carillion embarked on an acquisition spree that would make a Wall Street raider blush. The company snapped up competitors across multiple sectors, expanding from pure construction into facilities management, rail maintenance, and even defense contracting. In 2008, they acquired Molam, a respected British civil engineering company, for $350 million. 2 years later, they bought EGA, a renewable energy company, for $298 million. But the crown jewel was the 2014 acquisition of Rocstad Power Corporation in Canada for $200 million, marking Carillion's aggressive push into international markets. Each acquisition was funded through a combination of debt and creative accounting that made the company's balance sheet look healthier than it actually was. The company's revenue grew from $2.4 billion in 2007 to over $5 billion by 2016. But underneath this impressive growth was a fundamental problem. Carillion wasn't actually making money on many of its projects. They were simply moving debt around like pieces on a chessboard, hoping that future contracts would cover past losses. The rot at Carillion's core was hidden behind a facade of aggressive accounting practices that would have impressed Enron's executives. The company became masters of something called revenue recognition manipulation, booking projected profits from multi-year contracts immediately rather than recognizing them as work was completed. When Carillion won a $100 million contract expected to take 3 years, they would often book $20 or $30 million in profits right away, assuming everything would go perfectly. They also pioneered the use of something called early payment facilities, essentially selling their future receivables to banks at a discount to get cash immediately. By 2017, Carillion had drawn down over $498 million through these facilities, money they would never be able to pay back. Perhaps most egregiously, the company consistently underestimated the costs of their projects while overestimating the profits, a practice so systematic that it could only be described as institutional fraud. When projects inevitably ran over budget, which happened on virtually every major contract, Carillion would simply push the losses into future accounting periods, creating a snowball effect of hidden debt. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to look. In 2016, Carillion's auditors at KPMG raised concerns about the company's accounting practices, particularly around contract accounting and revenue recognition. The auditors identified what they called significant deficiencies in Carillion's internal controls, but these warnings were buried in technical audit reports that few outside the company bothered to read. Meanwhile, short sellers began circling like vultures, recognizing that Carillion's debt-to-equity ratio of over 650% was unsustainable. The company was paying out more in dividends to shareholders than it was generating in actual cash flow, a practice that should have triggered alarm bells across the financial establishment. Between 2012 and 2016, Carillion paid out $554 million in dividends while generating only $159 million in cash from operations. They were literally paying shareholders with borrowed money, a Ponzi scheme disguised as dividend policy. The construction industry press began publishing critical articles about Carillion's business model, with Building magazine running a prescient piece in early 2017 titled, "Is Carillion Too Big to Fail?" The answer, as it turned out, was no. The beginning of the end came in July 2017 when Carillion issued its first profit warning, announcing that several major contracts were performing worse than expected. The company revealed that their contract with the Royal Liverpool University Hospital would result in additional costs of £45 million, while the Midland Metropolitan Hospital project would require an extra £75 million. These weren't isolated problems. They were symptoms of a systemic issue with Carillion's bidding and project management processes. The company had consistently underbid on projects to win contracts, then relied on change orders and variations to make up the difference. When clients pushed back on these additional costs, Carillion found itself trapped in loss-making contracts with no way out. The profit warning triggered a cascade of problems. The company's share price plummeted by 40% in a single day. Banks began demanding additional collateral for existing loans, and suppliers started demanding cash on delivery rather than extending credit. Richard Howson, who had taken over as CEO in 2011, found himself trying to plug a dam with his bare hands while water rushed through a dozen other holes. As autumn 2017 turned into winter, Carillion's situation became increasingly desperate. The company's pension deficit had ballooned to $587 million across 13 different schemes, money they simply didn't have. Their debt pile had reached $1.5 billion, while cash reserves had dwindled to less than $300 million. In a last-ditch effort to stay afloat, Carillion negotiated a standstill agreement with its banks, essentially asking creditors to freeze their demands while the company tried to restructure. They brought in consultants from PwC and investment bankers from Lazard, paying millions in fees to advisors while telling employees that cost cuts were necessary for survival. The government, recognizing the potential catastrophe of a Carillion collapse, held emergency meetings to discuss contingency plans, but publicly maintained that it was business as usual. Behind the scenes, however, officials were already identifying which contractors could take over Carillion's most critical projects and how to minimize disruption to public services. The final act of this corporate tragedy played out in the first weeks of January 2018. Carillion's banks, led by Royal Bank of Scotland and Santander, refused to provide additional funding without government guarantees. The company needed at least $200 million immediately just to meet payroll and supplier payments. But their credit facilities were maxed out and no one was willing to lend to what had become a corporate zombie. On January 14th, the board held an emergency meeting that lasted deep into the night, with directors conferencing in from around the world as they grappled with the inevitable. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Carillion owed more money than it could ever hope to pay back, and their pipeline of future work wasn't sufficient to cover their existing obligations. At 7 a.m. on January 15, 2018, the board voted to place the company into compulsory liquidation, making Carillion the largest construction company failure in British history. Within hours, thousands of workers were told not to report to job sites, suppliers were informed that outstanding invoices might never be paid, and government officials were activating emergency protocols to take over crucial public services. The immediate aftermath of Carillion's collapse was chaos on an unprecedented scale. The company had been responsible for maintaining 50,000 homes for military families, cleaning 900 government buildings, and providing meals for 130,000 school children daily. When Carillion disappeared overnight, the government had to scramble to ensure that hospitals stayed clean, soldiers had somewhere to live, and children didn't go hungry. The official receiver, acting as liquidator, discovered that Carillion's books were in such disarray that determining the exact scope of the company's obligations would take years. The pension deficit alone affected 27,000 current and former employees, requiring a taxpayer-funded bailout through the Pension Protection Fund. Subcontractors and suppliers, many of them small businesses that had extended credit to Carillion, faced their own potential bankruptcies as millions in unpaid invoices became worthless. The ripple effects spread throughout the construction industry, with other contractors suddenly finding it difficult to secure credit as banks became wary of construction sector exposure. The human cost of Carillion's collapse extended far beyond the immediate job losses. Construction workers who had been employed by the company for decades found themselves unemployed overnight, often discovering that their final paychecks would never arrive. Many had invested years of their careers with Carillion, building expertise in complex infrastructure projects that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. The pension fund members faced cuts to their expected retirement benefits, with some seeing reductions of up to 10% in their projected monthly payments. Hospital construction projects ground to a halt, leaving communities without promised healthcare facilities and forcing the NHS to find expensive temporary solutions. The Royal Liverpool University Hospital, which had been scheduled to open in 2017, remained unfinished years after Carillion's collapse, with patients continuing to use outdated facilities while taxpayers funded yet another contractor to complete the work. Small businesses that had worked as subcontractors for Carillion faced a cascade of their own failures as unpaid invoices worth millions became uncollectible debt that many couldn't survive. The Carillion scandal revealed fundamental flaws in how Britain regulated its corporate sector and managed public-private partnerships. Parliamentary investigations discovered that the company's directors had continued paying themselves bonuses even as they knew the business was failing, with CEO Richard Howson receiving a £660,000 bonus in 2016 despite the mounting problems. The government's reliance on a handful of large contractors for critical infrastructure created systemic risk that policymakers had failed to properly assess or manage. Carillion's collapse forced a complete rethinking of public procurement, with new rules requiring greater financial transparency from contractors and more rigorous monitoring of company health. The total cost to taxpayers of Carillion's failure eventually reached an estimated £148 million in direct government intervention costs, plus billions more in project delays and pension fund bailouts. But perhaps the most damaging legacy was the erosion of trust in Britain's construction industry and the public-private partnership model that had been championed by successive governments. The company that had named itself after church bells had instead become a funeral knell for an entire approach to public infrastructure, leaving behind a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing short-term financial engineering over long-term operational excellence.